Welcome back, 365 Sports. Paul Catalina, and joined by Tyler Webb, who's, I'm going to call him sports business reporter, but also podcaster. Tyler, I've followed you on Twitter here for a little while now, and I really like what you do, especially when it comes to sports business and some different things around it and highlighting it. Before we kind of get into some of the topics we're going to talk about, what kind of led you to this niche of the way that you do things with your Twitter threads, with your newsletter, YouTube socials and all that?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Paul. I was never the star on the field. And so when I was relating to professional athletes growing up and now since graduating, I found myself more drawn to the human interest stories, the stories that were happening off the field. And I found that there was a lot going on in the world of sports business. Frankly, a lot of things that I don't think get talked about because they get pasted over with the wins and losses and us rooting for our favorite players. And there's a lot that goes on. And as professional sports become much more commoditized and it just become more of a central part of how we vote, where our tax dollars go, I think they're important stories to talk about. So I found myself drawn to those, and increasingly other people have as well.
Absolutely. By the way, some breaking news. Kansas has got a transfer we'll talk about in a second, Garrett. I'm going to send that to you. But Tyler, you broke down, there's several stories that, and again, like this is kind of the perfect time of year to talk about these things because we're kind of in the midst of the transitional time. But, there are a lot of, we're mostly college sports that we cover here, but we also cover the NFL. But the Panther Stadium is really interesting to me because they do host, the ACC championship. They're going to want to they host bowl games. They host a lot of different things. So they have not upgraded their stadium at all since 1996 when it was built. They haven't done anything to it. And now David Tepper, who I believe is the third richest owner or the second richest owner in the NFL, is asking for more than $750 million to redo it, and he's going to kick in part of his. What were the most intriguing things about that, and how do you think that shakes out, especially considering that Panthers fans want one thing that's not included in it?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head here. So Bank of America Stadium, built in 1996, one of the oldest, most outdated stadiums in the NFL. You actually had Adam Thielen earlier this week calling it one of the worst facilities in the NFL. So there's obviously some pressure here from the fans, likely from the city, and of course from the players to put some money into the stadium for some upgrades. The interesting part here is, as you know, David Tepper, one of the richest owners in the NFL, is requesting $650 million in taxpayer funding from the city of Charlotte. It's important to note that this money isn't going to come from any tax increases. There is a tourism tax that is in place in the city of Charlotte, and they're actually legally obligated to spend this money on activities that are going to increase revenue through tourism. So spending money on the stadium would obviously fit that bill. But there's obviously a lot of complaints here. And this isn't anything new. We see this all across sports where owners are essentially holding cities hostage, threatening to leave if they don't put up, in this case, $650 million for upgrades or even for new stadiums. Meanwhile, David Tepper, who's worth something like $20 billion, is only contributing $150 million in this initial renovation cycle, which is set to go through 2029.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I do think it's going to happen. Again, what you see here a lot of times is owners going to cities and saying, look, this is going to be something that is beneficial for you. You see these studies come out that say over the course of the next, call it 20 years, we're going to bring something like $16 billion in economic impact is often the term that gets thrown around to the city. Now, I draw issue with a lot of these studies because the term economic impact is really broad and doesn't often take into account things like replacement costs. Like people in Charlotte would spend money other places if the Panthers cease to exist tomorrow. There was a study done in Chicago that was really interesting that said if all the teams in Chicago, and obviously they have two baseball teams, they have a football team, they have a basketball team, they have a hockey team, if they were to all leave the city of Chicago, the economic impact of the city or the economy of the city would only shrink by about 1%. So people would find ways to spend money elsewhere. But they can say, we're going to bring these huge events. You mentioned the ACC championship to town, and there are going to be second order effects on the local economy that help politicians pitch it to the taxpayers that, hey, it's worth it to spend $650 million. So in the long term, I think this happens, and especially when you have your own players calling out how bad the stadium is, there's probably just too much pressure on this thing for it not to happen.
Yeah, Chiefs and Panthers right now. I mean, the Chiefs players also they're mad about theirs as well. They had the grades that came out were terrible for that. So now they all have more of a voice too. So it's maybe easier for some of this stuff to get called out and embarrass the owners. And David Tepper probably needs some PR after it's been very abysmal for him as an owner so far in the NFL.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think that Chiefs one is really interesting that you bring up because the Chiefs president explicitly said we might consider leaving Kansas City, Kansas, if this funding package, similar to how it exists over in Carolina, exists in Kansas City. They said that they might consider leaving Kansas City, Kansas, if the stadium bill isn't passed. And of course, this doesn't mean that they're getting relocated to Oklahoma City, but it might mean that they move to a different neighborhood. They leave that stadium complex that obviously has Kauffman Stadium right next to it. So it's really interesting how owners try to leverage the fandom. And then at the end of the day, this is a tangible thing that fans are going to be able to enjoy. I mean, when we talk about the renovations to Bank of America Stadium, we're talking about new bathrooms, new escalators, new community areas outside of the stadium, things that will have a tangible impact on the fan experience. And at the end of the day, fans will probably look back on this and say, it was the balk of the price, but it's something that's going to benefit them down the line as well.
Yeah, but it also doesn't really, no community that's like the city's not going to make back the money at all. Like that never happens, right? Like they just decide this is where we're going to spend it on. And the whole, like you mentioned, that economic impact, the city really never sees that again.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm mostly talking about how the politicians are going to pitch it to their constituents because, again, we have never really seen this happen, or it's happened sparsely across the history of all sports. But teams picking up shop and moving to a completely different city is exceedingly rare. However, you also don't want to be the politician that happens under. So you're really stuck between a rock and a hard place where your taxpayers don't want you to spend this ludicrous, these price tags that we're seeing seem to get higher and higher. The $650 million price tag, if it passes and the vote is on June 24th, will go down as the most expensive NFL stadium renovation project since 2017 when the Dolphins renovated Hard Rock Stadium for $500 million. So you're stuck between this rock and a hard place where there's a huge gaudy price tag, but at the same time, you don't want to be the politician responsible for letting your local stadium deteriorate or, God forsaken, your team leave the city.
Yeah, you don't want to be. Oakland stood up to the A's, and that's where they are. They've lost everybody all the way around. So, Tyler, you also wrote on the Sunday Ticket lawsuit, which, as a former DirecTV Sunday Ticket subscriber, I'm super interested in because I would love $2,500. So I'm all for the other side in this one. Let's get me that $2,500 because I had it for a very long time. How do you see this playing out? And basically, NBA, MLB, I believe the NHL has it too, where you can just watch the team you want to if you're out of market, right, Garrett?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, so you don't have to, watch every game. The NFL has it to where, I don't care if you like the Vikings or not. You're watching the Vikings if you have the Sunday Ticket.
Yeah, this one is really interesting, and credit to the NFL propaganda machine for allowing it to fly under the radar. But essentially what happened back in 2015, a class action lawsuit was filed against the NFL and DirecTV, who held the rights to Sunday Ticket at the time and did until a couple of years ago when YouTube TV obviously took over the rights there. And the lawsuit was exactly what you just described. The NFL is the only professional sports league in which you have to buy every game from every team in an out-of-market package, whereas the MLB, the NHL have these regional sports networks where you can subscribe just to those networks. And of course, they have a litany of issues themselves, solvency being one of them. But you can buy only a package for your team, which in turn reduces the price. The NFL has said, we're going to bundle these together. We're going to sell them as one major package, and we're going to split that revenue evenly across all of our teams, which is a really good deal, especially for some of these smaller market teams. I think of teams like Jacksonville, Green Bay, who might not otherwise be able to command the $62.5 million a year through their current YouTube TV deal that they would selling the rights individually. But what happened was fans got wise to this. 2.4 million fans are a part of this lawsuit, and another 48,000 businesses, and said, I think it's unfair. This is monopoly type pricing. You charging us for all these games at once. We're going to file a lawsuit. And experts are estimating that if this goes to trial and the NFL loses, they could be on the hook for somewhere over $6 billion, which the back of the napkin math there is if there's somewhere around 2.5 million plaintiffs in this case, over $6 billion would be around $2,500 per person, as you described. But that's, of course, not accounting for legal fees that obviously all come out of the settlement. So maybe at the end of the day, unfortunately, you might only see a couple $100. But I think that the real crux of this is that if this goes through settlement, and I want to be clear here, I really don't think that's going to happen for the stakes that I'm about to lay out to you. I don't think the NFL, as they have in the past, they have not let these things go to trial and risk a verdict that is counter to what they want to have happen. So what could happen if this reaches trial, the NFL loses, the $6 billion gets paid out. This would also set the precedent that each NFL team would have the ability to sell their individual media rights, just like you talked about the MLB and NHL teams already do. And for a lot of these NFL teams, probably for most of them, frankly, this would be a boon in business. I mean, when you look at the top teams in the other leagues, like the Lakers, the Dodgers, and the Warriors, all of these teams are commanding over $150 million per year for their local media rights, and they're averaging something like fewer than 2 million viewers per game, whereas NFL games consistently average 10+ million viewers per game. You could see these teams commanding much, much more than NBA and MLB teams, and right now they're only making somewhere in the neighborhood of $62.5 million per year through this YouTube TV deal. So it's possible, especially big market teams like the teams in New York, the Cowboys, could be commanding $200, $300 million per year if they were allowed to sell their own media rights. The NFL obviously doesn't want this to happen. They like to have this control. So it's unlikely they're going to let this case reach all the way to trial. And you've seen them settle cases in the past, most notably the one where they were relocating the Rams out of St. Louis. They settled that case, paid $1 billion or a couple $1 billion in damages just to get it out of the news cycle.
One of the more, and this might be obscure to people who are not on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I still refuse to kind of call it X, but the Dov Kleinman story is really interesting because he amassed a massive amount of followers, and this was at a time before Twitter was even monetized that he had quite a bit. And then now that Twitter is monetized, he was an aggregator. He wasn't creating or breaking any news on his own. He was taking highlights. It was a total aggregation site. He didn't make many bones about that, but he did run afoul of like people didn't like kind of what he was doing. But you have done a lot of work on this. Front Office Sports did a lot of work on this. What happened with him? And is he did he sell his Twitter page? Or I guess that's the theory, because it seems to have been different, and that's not something that you can do based on the Twitter agreement.
Yeah, you're right. This is a total inside baseball story, but it's probably one of my favorite of the offseason. So you're exactly right. Dove is a Twitter aggregator. So what that means is he'll take a report from an Adam Schefter, an Ian Rappaport, and he'll copy and paste what they report, and he'll credit them with their at the end of the tweet, which is fine. You're right. He makes no bones about it. He's not an NFL reporter or insider. He's purely somebody who takes all the best information he sees and puts it onto one Twitter feed. I think there is some value in that service. The issue is when he takes information, strips out the context, and presents it as something other than it is. So the straw that broke the camel's back this past week was when he tweeted that Mark Davis was expecting a child with his 26-year-old girlfriend at the age of 70. And where he got this from was a woman that Mark Davis was seated next to last year on a Monday Night Football broadcast, announced that she was pregnant. She's a 26-year-old model. The only time that Mark Davis and this woman had been seeing each other was in one screenshot from one Monday Night Football broadcast last year. But what Dove did was took that screenshot, put a picture of this attractive young 26-year-old on the screen and said, 70-year-old Mark Davis, 26-year-old girlfriend is expecting her baby. Congrats to the expecting couple or something like that. So he creates this narrative out of whole cloth that is just patently not true. And then he later had to delete this post after it went viral, reaching millions of people. This model herself had to release a statement that said, I'm not dating Mark Davis. I've only ever sat next to him once and met him one time. But that's the sort of content manipulation that aggregators like Dove, there are several others on Twitter, will do. And like you said, there's now a financial benefit for them to do that and for them to drive a bunch of engagement because Twitter will now pay you based on how many people see a tweet. So maybe a tweet that gets 15 million people will make you a couple $100, something like that. So Dove has been doing this for a couple years, a massive following of close to 300,000 people. But around the Super Bowl last year, people noticed a tone shift in his post. It seemed like he was doing less of the reporting that he could maybe talk himself into, convince himself that he was doing. And he started doing more of this engagement baiting, posting purposely inflammatory things on Twitter in hopes of, reaching millions of people and then, of course, cashing out. And that tone shift, people lined up with a lot of credit to AJ Perez here from Office Sports you mentioned. He looked back through a cryptocurrency wallet that was linked to Dove's Twitter. And he noticed that 8 days after the Super Bowl, there was a $21,000 crypto deposit made to this wallet. And then that's when the content started shifting. And he did some really good reporting, reaching out to other aggregators on Twitter and other prominent sports media figures on Twitter. And apparently Dove had been shopping around this account for a price point of around $75,000. People were countering. He didn't really think he could get that much money. And we think he ended up selling it for around $21,000. So now the question is, who's running this account? AJ Perez just released an article this week, actually, who he identified some guy in Florida who's apparently some internet prankster. The story kind of dies out from here. But the interesting part of it, which you mentioned, is that it's actually against Twitter terms of service to sell an account. And so if Twitter ever sniffed out the story to its logical conclusion, you could see one of the biggest aggregators online getting banned, and he's probably clearing something like six figures every year just by taking other people's reporting and putting it on his own Twitter feed. It's fascinating. It's total inside baseball, but it shows you where our sports media landscape is today, frankly.
Well, I feel like doing all this work on my own is kind of stupid. Really, I mean, look, I followed it mostly because when I do some production, he has highlights, so I would like to grab the audio from the highlights, for things, and so that's why I was following him. So yeah, I mean, he's a lot to dress it up. So I'm not, but again, he doesn't have to call anybody, run down anything. He just has to, go to TweetDeck and, have his little feed there. So the last thing I want to talk about, and usually this is what I would lead off with, but we've talked about it so much over the last week, but very curious your thoughts on House versus NCAA and how this plays out now that we're, 10 days or so out of the agreement, almost 2 weeks, I guess, of this happening. It still hasn't been approved yet by the judge. That's the next hurdle it has to cross. But where do you see that going? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, like you mentioned, you probably talked about it a lot with your audience. I see this as opening a can of worms that will never be closed to the NCAA. Frankly, I think that the NCAA's time of existence is now on the clock. So before these three cases came to settlement, which is what happened last week, and we obviously talk about the revenue sharing that can now happen with athletes, there were a lot of cases that were pending, one primarily in Dartmouth that I was keeping my eye on, where athletes were attempting to unionize. And the logic they were using was that, okay, if they're getting paid to play, they should also be able to have things like health benefits. They should be getting paid overtime. Essentially, they should be W-2 employees because they're now getting paid to play their sport through NIL. What I think happens now is that this decision for universities to directly pay athletes only bolsters those claims that athletes should be considered full-time employees at their universities. And when athletes are considered full-time universities at their employees, the NCAA's sole reason to exist, which is to protect amateurism in college sports, ceases to exist. And so what I think is really interesting now are what are the second-order effects of this decision? So obviously you'll have athletes making a bunch of money. You'll probably see scholarships being fully funded across sports. You might even see sports getting cut that are non-revenue driving. I think those are all really interesting second-order effects. But what I'm keeping my eye on are these unionization efforts, primarily the one with the Dartmouth men's basketball team, to see if their case now has greater standing because athletes will be getting paid directly through the universities. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's a can of worms that the NCAA will never be able to put back into the can, and that might be their inevitable demise. Allowing athletes to now get paid through the settlement, I think will only pave the way for athlete unionization, for this 22% of revenue sharing getting bumped up to 50% like we see at professional sports leagues. I just think we're on the fast track to having college sports look like professional sports. And I'll be honest, Paul, I don't hate that. I mean, I don't hate the fact that if we're okay making the logical jump from athletes should get some cut of revenue, why should we stop at 22%? Why shouldn't it be 50%. Why shouldn't athletes have collective bargaining power just like professional athletes do? We're on the fast track to that point.
Yeah, the NCAA's biggest problem is they don't understand that time always moves forward, and they're trying to pause it at the very least, and that also has failed. So I mean, I recommend if you didn't read it yet today, I talked about it at the top of our show. Joe Moglia, who is Coastal Carolina, he's been a CEO and a coach and all these things. He has a great op-ed in the Indy Star today about all this and the future of it, and how this is, again, this house is not a solution for anything. It's just it's a Bandaid for the time being, so they can get a little time to figure this out. But they're going to have to change almost everything they do within the next decade.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, this is the antiquated structure of the NCAA. They just keep trying to Band-Aid over their issues. NIL was a Band-Aid. This house settlement is a Band-Aid. And I think they're going to realize they're going to have to fix this system properly before it's too late.
Yeah, eventually you need stitches. Eventually you can't just keep wrapping it. You need stitches for sure. Tyler, I love what you do. People can follow him at Tyler M. Webb. It's tylerwebb.co, right, is the website?
Yeah, that's correct. I encourage people to go subscribe to my newsletter. I release these sports business stories, 3 of the best every week, every Friday. I have a new one dropping this Friday, and make sure to follow me on Twitter at Tyler M. Webb.
There you go. Thank you so much for hopping on, man. We'll talk again in the future.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Tyler Webb there. I know that was